when you physically die and you go through a passageway. The Hebrew word for it was ma'wet, and they described it as a dark tunnel, and there's a sorting out then and a review of what you did. And if you did more good than bad, you feel heavenly. If you did more bad than good, you feel hellish. Now let's go forward a couple thousand of years later with near-death experiences. Dr. Ken Ring, University of Connecticut, worked with more near-death experiences than anybody on the planet. Estimates that there are about 10,000 documented NDEers, meaning while they were clinically dead, their eyes were closed, they were in ICU or ER, they nonetheless perceived events, seeing an object on top of the hospital, seeing a car wreck outside the hospital, details during the resuscitative process. Again, while their brain wasn't working, they weren't breathing, their heart wasn't working, their eyes were closed. After successful resuscitation, these people accurately described these events without any exposure to family and friends from whom they could have learned that. Again, they were interviewed by university professors, medical doctors, and so on. 10,000 cases like this, some of whom were blind at the time, physically blind, some of whom been blind from birth. So this is very strong evidence that consciousness is active independently of the brain. And Dr. Ring assembled a team of vision experts, and no one could come up with an alternative explanation for this. So now here we have the Aramaic meaning of a word a couple thousand years ago. And what do these near-death experiences come back and say? Part of what I went through was a life review where I not only saw, but felt what I did. I felt the pain I inflicted on others, and I realized that heaven and hell are primarily not places, but states of consciousness, levels of energy that we can experience here or in the hereafter, depending on our predominant thoughts, words, and deeds.
So, who does the sorting in that in those visions? Because you mentioned that when they go through this tunnel, they're being sorted. What or who is doing the sorting?
Yeah, and these are all excellent questions, by the way, Kyle. I'm impressed that you obviously have given this a lot of thought. I appreciate it for your listeners and viewers as well. Again, we use the word soul, but the person who has passed, and usually they are described as having help. Now, Dr. Schwartz and I have adopted the word higher energy assistance. HEA is abbreviation, but higher energy assistance, because some people understandably don't like religious terms, archaic terms. So whether you want to say these are higher energy assistants or angels, guides, master teachers, helping these people along has been well described. And the purpose of the life review, by the way, is not punitive or judgmental. It's all about learning and growth. And so the person who passed is able to pause this recording like you're watching your life on a DVD. You can go back and rewind and look at the good parts. You can kind of fast forward through the bad ones, but that's part of what happens from all the available information.
And you said when you were a small child and you had those kind of abnormal experiences, would you say that you have memories of the time that you existed before you actually were in the material world, or any kind of connection that you can recall from that place?
I don't have conscious memories of, call it life between lives or a dimension before I came into this physical body. What I did have was a real difficulty fitting in. I consciously realized I needed to learn how to be a good earthling, because even as a little kid, I like football, I like sports, I played all the sports, but watching a big game, I would think, if they took just 1/10 of the time, energy, and money they spent for this, move a pigskin down the field to feed poor people, that sort of consciousness would help heal our world. What little kid thinks about things like that? My mom and dad and brother and sister would be watching sitcoms in the TV room with that canned laughter. It just drove me crazy. So I'd go in a different room and read, or I'd just get down on the floor and start doing stretches. And years later, I found out those were yoga postures. So when I read the book Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Ludlum, I was like, oh, yeah, that's the perfect phrase for me. And lots of people have this, by the way. People who are more intermediate or advanced souls find out they have to learn how to play the game because they know at varying levels that they are in this world, but they're not solely of this world.
So okay, so you are conscious of that. Let's shift now to the meat of the story, I guess. I think that I wanted to paint kind of a picture of where you're coming from for everybody and your kind of life experiences that got you to this place, because I think that's important to lay down first. But as somebody like myself who is, I would consider myself highly skeptical of the idea of concept. Of course, everybody wants something like that to be true. It's so far outside of what I think is possible that it leads me to a bunch of questions about it. And the first question that I have pertains to something that you said earlier in the show, when you mentioned that the dream team, the Albert Einstein, the Nikola Tesla, these icons of science and truth seeking are aiding in the development of this. And one of the examples that you gave was the switch, how it would do the yes no, whether it be for a name, a letter associated with that name, their date of birth, deaths. How is that verifiably Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla? Like, when you get those results, how do you know that's not just well, how do you get the results? Can you kind of go into a little bit more detail on that? Like, how are you actually getting these responses from these icons?
Yeah, well, again, there are a few questions in there. Yeah, it's called the A Team. And the first way that Dr. Schwartz had an inkling that they were interested in helping and able to help was, again, through 10 of the top mediums. We're talking people like George Anderson, John Edwards, Suzanne Northrup, Suzanne Giesman, who is, by the way, a former commander in the Navy and the top assistant to the Joint Chief of Staff. These are all really credible people. And so individually, they would say, Gary, I'm getting Nikola Tesla coming through to me spontaneously saying, would you please get hold of Dr. Schwartz for me? We understand he's doing some work. We want to help him. And so, being the scientist he is, Dr. Schwartz kept all this blind. In other words, he wouldn't share it with the other mediums he would know. So when the same sort of information came in from numerous people independently, that was one clue. Secondly, the evidence that this is really happening is the accuracy of their input. As I mentioned, one time he was stuck on a certain phase of the research, and there's something he couldn't figure out. And one of the mediums said, I don't even know if this is a word, but what is coming through for me is this. It was like capacitance, impedance, conductance, like 3 words like that. Gary said, oh my God, it's exactly what I need to know. And that filled in a piece of the puzzle for him. And this has happened many times. The third way that we know that this very likely is happening, this appears to be happening, is, as I mentioned, them passing the personal identification test and the knowledge test, which have been replicated. But the ultimate answer to that, and by the way, you're the kind of skeptic we like because you're a skeptic who asks questions. A closed-minded skeptic would say, this is BS, you guys are crazy, I don't believe it. Okay, those kind of people, there's no talking with them. You're a skeptic. what we call open-minded skeptic, and so are we. You have to be that way, especially when dealing with such immense breakthroughs here. So the ultimate way would be to let them explain themselves, to let them divulge their identity themselves. You mentioned earlier that one of the big focuses of this cell phone technology was to allow communication with loved ones who had crossed over, and that's true. But just as large, maybe larger for the impact of our planet, is that these luminaries are willing and able to, once we are able to probably text, to give webinars, to work with teams of scientists, and pass on key information in every area, climate control, healthcare, etc., population control, to help us heal our world. By the way, I should mention that Dr. Schwartz founded the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. Last year, they have now over 350 scientists, university professors, and physicians from around the world whose working hypothesis is that consciousness is primary. That is not just a byproduct, a temporary byproduct of the brain. And they expect those numbers to swell to 1,000. So there are numerous neuroscientists and other serious scientists and researchers around the world who are open to this possibility. So at this point, we've kind of backed off. I mean, we talk about the A team. Dr. Schwartz's wife, Rhonda, who's one of the research mediums, wrote a book called Love Eternal. She talks about it. We talk about it some in the Greater Reality Living book and the websites, soulphone.org and greaterrealityliving.com. But for the most part, we're not going to talk too much about the A team because you're right, it's mind-blowing, and ultimately we cannot 100% prove. We're going to wait till we can let them explain themselves and introduce themselves.
Okay, so let's get into the actual pieces of technology that you're bringing, because this is what everybody wants to know about. So there are, from what I gather and what I've kind of looked at, the progression that you're looking at is going to be something from the Soul Switch to the Soul Keyboard, which will enable Soul Text, to Soul Phone, and then finally arriving at Soul Video. And I guess your ultimate goal is to package all of this in a Soul app, so to speak, so that you can literally do this from a smartphone. Now, walk me through how.
Excuse me. Yeah, let me interject.
Sure.
First of all, what you said is pretty much true, although it may not unfold in that way. In other words, some of the Soul Video technology has really taken off. And at one point, Dr. Schwartz thought that we may actually be able to see images of post-material persons before we can even get good yes, no answers. So go ahead.
Okay, so we'll start there then, because that's a big claim. What has led you to believe that would be possible to? And the question's twofold: how would that be possible, and what will you be looking at? Because when someone goes to, like, if I wanted to speak with my deceased grandfather, let's say, I would hope to expect to see my grandfather. Will I be seeing him, or will I be seeing something that represents what he is in the afterlife?
Yeah, it's a great question, a commonly asked one. So let's deal with the second part first. It's commonly reported when people have near-death experiences come back, and again, keep in mind, some of these are documented, so we have extra evidence that indeed their consciousness existed while they're clinically dead and accurately saw, so that lends more credibility to what they report from, quote, the other side. So let's say you did pass on tonight from some, or nearly die, rather, and your grandfather greeted you. Typically, does he look like your grandfather for eternity? No, for God's sake, who would want to look like a 85-year-old guy, whatever, forever? However, he can manifest for a while in that form to reassure you, to comfort you, to allow you to identify who he is. Once you're comfortable with he is much more than his Earth suit that you remember, then he can resume form however he likes.